Depression and sadness of spiritual origin. One, mental and spiritual illness. The prevailing ideas of psychiatry about health and mental illness have nothing absolute about them. They rely on a conception of health and normality, which the anti-psychiatric movement has pointed to as doubtful, showing that the models for these norms are highly relative and vary according to the cultures or societies that condition their definition. The difference between patristic and modern psychiatric nosography does not allow us to establish many or precise connections. On the other hand, even today, there are well-known variations between different schools and countries in the way mental illnesses are classified and defined. The very possibility of a unified classification poses great problems. Also, connections are more possible between symptoms than between syndromes. One important difference is due to the fact that modern psychiatry is based on a medical model, and as such embraces a naturalistic perspective that a priori excludes any reference to the religious or moral domain. 1. A certain number of problems, examined by standard modern nosography, appear to be related to what patristic nosology called the passion of pride. Modern psychiatry, while not unaware of the pathogenic character of this attitude, has, however, divorced it from its moral and spiritual dimension, most often designating it as a self-valorization or hypertrophy of the ego. This attitude is present to a high degree in paranoid psychoses. It is also found in hysteria. Many of the difficulties in maintaining relationships, a symptom present in the majority of neuroses, can be connected with it. In the same order of reality is what has commonly been called narcissism since the time of Freud. This also corresponds to the passion of pride and even more to philadelphia, or the passionate love of oneself, which often has the body as its primary object. 2. The anxiety and anguish present in most psychoses, as well as in all neuroses, can be linked in part to what the fathers considered to be the passions of fear and sadness. 3. The aggressiveness to be found in the majority of neuroses and in certain psychoses can be linked to the passion of anger, in the broad sense, as we have defined it. 4. Debility, a symptom common to many mental illnesses, corresponds rather closely to one of the essential components of acedia. 5. Depressive symptoms, to be found in many neuroses and psychoses, can be directly linked to acedia and sadness. Apart from these symptoms, several syndromes appear to be connected to the passions in spiritual nosology. 6. Thus, neurotic phobias appear to have some connection with the passion of fear. They're moreover standardly defined as agonizing fears. 7. Anxiety neurosis can be understood in relation to the passion of sadness, but also, and above all, to fear. 8. Psychotic melancholia can be to some degree connected with both acedia and sadness, especially in its extreme form of despair. 9. Without any doubt, the closest and most direct relationship can be established between the acedia and sadness of patristic nosology and the different forms of depression. Nor has this relationship failed to attract the attention of certain psychiatrists who have recently devoted several studies to this subject. And its importance warrants our repeating the essentials of the analysis we have devoted to these two passions, limiting ourselves, however, to their psychic dimensions and effects. Sadness appears to be a state of soul, which, beside the simple meaning of the word, involves discouragement, debility, psychic heaviness and sorrow, dejection, distress, oppression, and depression, most often accompanied by anxiety and even with anguish. This condition can have many causes, but it always involves a pathological reaction of the soul's irascible and/or desiring faculty, and as such is essentially tied to concupiscence or anger. Sadness, Evagrius tells us, tends to come up at times because of the deprivation or frustration of one's desires. On other occasions, it accompanies anger, but it can also be a result of the direct action of demons on the soul, or it may even arise for no apparent reason. Let us consider these different etiologies in detail. First cause, the frustration of desires. Evagrius tells us sadness is formed from an unsatisfied carnal desire. St. John Cassian likewise notes that sadness sometimes results when we see ourselves deceived with regard to some hope, and that one of its chief kinds follows from a desire that has been thwarted. In that, every desire is tied to a passion. Every passion is prone to produce sadness. According to Evagrius, whoever loves the world will often be sad. One can also say that pleasure is tied to desire, and as Evagrius says, sadness is a deprivation of sensual pleasure, whether actually present or only hoped for. St. Maximus and St. Thalassios also define it in these terms, stressing that sensual pleasure is inevitably followed by sorrow most often being psychic rather than physical, taking, in other words, the form of sadness. St. Maximus affirms that sadness is the end result of sensual pleasure, insofar as it results from the frustration of some carnal desire, using carnal in the broad sense of this term, and its associated pleasure. Sadness reveals an attachment on the part of the affected individual to sensual goods and the values of the world. This is why Evagrius stresses that it is linked to all the passions, to the degree that they imply covetousness, and asserts, if we continue to cherish some affection for anything in this world, it is impossible to repel this enemy. St. Dorotheus of Gaza says much the same. If a man does not despise all material things, he cannot be delivered from sorrow. St. John Climacus remarks that whoever has come to hate the world has escaped sorrow, but whoever has an attachment to anything visible is not yet delivered from grief. For how is it possible not to be sad at the loss of something we love? He also notes that if anyone thinks that he is without attachment to some object, but is grieved at its loss, then he is completely deceiving himself. Also, one often sees sadness provoked by the loss of some tangible good, by whatever injury suffered on the same plane. The passional attachment of man to his earthly life and to what it includes, for the satisfaction of his passions, can equally give rise to sadness in the ordeals with, or thoughts about, everything that might imperil it, namely illness, all the evils to which one is exposed, and death. Sadness can also result from envy of some moral or material good possessed by another. It can likewise have its origin in some deception, used in order to obtain honors, and then is necessarily tied to vainglory. Again, let us note that sadness may not be provoked by the frustration of a particular desire, having to do with a quite specific object. It may be tied to a more general dissatisfaction, an overall sense of frustration with one's entire life, revealing that a person's deep-seated desires, the true significance of which are not always clearly known, have not been fulfilled. Second cause, anger. Sadness, as Evagrius teaches, can come from thoughts of anger. In effect, he explains, anger is a desire for vengeance, and unsatisfied vengeance produces sadness. St. Maximus says the same. Sadness is linked with rancor. When the intellect forms the image of a brother's face with a feeling of resentment, it is clear that it harbors rancor against him. St. John Cassian also affirms this, without going into details. Sadness sometimes follows upon the vice of anger. And he further notes that a kind of sadness is begotten once anger has ceased. Sadness can occur in connection with feelings other than rancor. It often results from the feeling that one's anger was excessive or disproportionate to what had stimulated it, or that, to the contrary, it did not have a sufficient impact or elicit the expected reaction. Sadness can also be produced by some offense, or what is believed to be such. When we are wronged, or think that we have been wronged, we become sad. St. John of Damascus observes, in nearly all these cases, and like the anger that precedes it, this passion reveals an attachment to oneself and is linked to vanity and pride. It manifests a reaction of the frustrated ego in its desire for self-affirmation, in which the second cause is joined to the first, and lowers self-esteem. Often linked to sadness, rancor is also resentment for wounded pride, and anger, the source of the same passion, frequently expresses a will to reaffirm, enhance, and reassure the ego, namely, oneself and others. Sadness reveals itself to be then an expression of the ego's failure or impotence in its attempt at self-rehabilitation. Unmotivated sadness. St. John Cassian tells us that it sometimes happens that we are suddenly filled with an anxiety that has no cause. We feel overwhelmed by a sadness for which no motive can be found. He also says that there are two different kinds of sadness. The first consists of all those varieties considered above. The second comes from unreasonable mental anguish, or despair. The line between this kind of sadness and the passion of Acedia, which we will examine later, is far from precise. The demons play an important role in the birth, development, and perpetuation of all the forms of sadness or depression, especially the kind just discussed. If it is said to be without cause, this is because there is no direct relationship with any definite action on the part of the person affected, because it is not, like the preceding cases, the fruit of some unsatisfied desire or of a movement of anger, but not because it truly has no cause. The fathers recognize in such cases that it is most often produced by some demonic influence. As St. John Cassian remarks, occasionally we are even provoked to fall into this misfortune, for no apparent reason, when we are suddenly weighed down by great sorrow at the instigation of the clever foe. St. John Chrysostom, in analyzing the state of his friend, Stagirius, who suffered from a profound depression, also stressed in several places the role of demonic influence. He wrote to his friend saying, "The devil surrounds your mind with these dark sorrows as with a deep obscurity, and strives to rob you of any thought that might reassure you. Finding your soul isolated, he overwhelms it with blows and wounds." The eruption of a sense of sadness in the soul is moreover one of the most immediate effects of demonic activity. The thoughts that come to one from the demon are first of all distressing and mixed with sadness, notes St. Barsanuphius. Conversely, one can say that every state of sadness in the soul is in every circumstance a sign of demonic activity. Everything that causes distress and sadness comes from the demons, reiterates this great elder. However external events might arise and motivate sadness, it must be stressed that such is truly not its real source. They are the occasion, not the cause, which rather lies uniquely in the very soul of the individual, and more precisely, in the attitude adopted with regard to himself and exterior events. Thus, he is responsible for the sadness which affects him. Both the exterior circumstances and the evils that afflict him basically only serve as excuses. St. John Chrysostom tells us that our joys and sadness come not so much from the nature of things as from our own dispositions. If they are wisely directed, we will always have a great store of contentment in our hearts. Bodily illnesses have as their cause some interior disorder, rather than inclement weather, or any other external influence. But this is even more so for maladies of the soul. For if those of the body are the lot of our nature, those of the soul belong only to our will. Even when the demons give rise to, or maintain these states of despondency, they can do so only because they find a favorable terrain in the soul and benefit from a certain participation, more or less conscious, of the individual's will. Thus, St. John Chrysostom can say to Stagirius, "The demon is not the author of this dark grief that is in you, but it is the grief itself, which comes to the aid of the demon and suggests these evil thoughts." Very often sadness is prior to the direct intervention of the devil, who is only taking advantage of the situation to augment the passion. The passion of sadness can take an extreme form, namely despair. This is one of its most serious manifestations. An excessive sadness is dangerous, remarks St. John Chrysostom, so dangerous that it can even cause death. In the growth of despair, the devil plays a particularly important role, and by means of this condition can provoke in the soul catastrophic consequences. The devil, St. John Chrysostom tells us, has no greater weapon in his hands than despair. We also give him less pleasure in sinning than in despairing. In this condition, the individual basically despairs of God and cuts himself off from him. As a result, he leaves the field free for the devil's action, and bound hand and foot, yields to his power, and is given up to spiritual death. As St. Paul teaches, "The sadness of the world worketh death." Under the effect of despair, and sometimes even simply from sadness, man often comes to embrace corrupt passions, thinking that they might bring a remedy for his condition, if only to save him from an awareness of this condition. Thus the apostle states, "Having lost all hope, they are free to embrace licentiousness, unto the working of all uncleanness, plunged in impurity." Following him, St. Gregory the Great tells us that the end result of sadness is the straying of the spirit towards forbidden things. A source of spiritual death, despair can also lead a man to suicide, inciting him to no longer expect anything from life. It implants ideas of suicide in his soul and prompts him to accomplish them. In explaining this matter, St. John Chrysostom maintained the possibility of a demonic influence, but stressed that it was not the only cause, as he wished to once again insist on the responsibility of the individual himself. "These baneful thoughts," he wrote to Stagirius, "do not only come from the demon. Your own melancholy is also very much to blame. Yes, indeed, this dark sadness, even more than the evil spirit, provokes these thoughts, and perhaps they are the only cause. It is certain that some individuals, quite apart from any demonic obsession, suffer this mania for suicide after excessive suffering." He also says that a deep sadness, even where there is no demonic influence, gives birth to the greatest evils. It is under the pressure of a dark depression that these unfortunate individuals place a noose around their neck, stab themselves with a dagger, try to drown themselves, or have recourse to other forms of violent death. Even those in whom the activity of the evil spirit becomes clear should cast less blame on it than on the tyranny and excess of their own grief. For all these reasons, sadness is considered by the Fathers an illness of the soul, one that is of great importance and with powerful effects. A fortiori, such is the situation with despair. "Great is the tyranny of sadness," says St. John Chrysostom. "It is an illness of the spirit that demands considerable strength to resist it courageously and to reject what is evil in it." The Fathers often present this passion as a form of insanity that manifests itself in a particularly clear manner, in despair. Thus, St. Syncletica, referring to the sadness that comes from the enemy, says that it is full of insanity. And St. John Cassian notes that if through fleeting and changing happenstance it has gained control of our soul, it weakens and oppresses the mind itself. Having destroyed all salutary counsel and driven out steadfastness of heart, it crazes, as it were, and stupefies the intellect, breaking and overwhelming it with a punishing despair. The pathological effects of sadness are important and powerful. "Give not up thy soul to sadness and afflict not thyself in thy own counsel," observes Ecclesiastes. St. John Chrysostom does not hesitate to say, "A profound sadness is more harmful to us than all the attacks of the evil spirit." Apart from the fact that sadness, if allowed to fester, almost inevitably gives rise to despair and its serious consequences. This passion produces some of the early signs of the person's passionate attitudes, such as surliness, wickedness, rancor, bitterness, spite, and impatience. As a result, this greatly disturbs the relations of the individual with his neighbors. Let us also note that, like all the other passions, sadness fills the soul with darkness. In the first place, it clouds the mind with darkness, blinds the intelligence, and considerably impairs the faculty of discernment. One of its specific effects is to weigh down the soul. It moreover produces in all the faculties of man a state of lethargy and indifference, making him faint-hearted and paralyzing his ability to act. This last effect becomes particularly serious on the spiritual plane, where it deprives the person of all his dynamism, thwarts his ascetic efforts, and pillages prayer. This is especially true when it follows upon some shortcoming.